The story begins in a small, isolated town, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers are noticed immediately. It was on a foggy autumn evening when Samuel Hawthorne first appeared, walking along the single road that led into town. Witnesses would later recall that there was something almost unreal about him, not just as odd. Old-fashioned clothing that seemed stitched from materials no one recognized, but the way he moved, as if slightly out of sync with the world around him. His eyes, an unusually pale shade of gray, seemed to take in everything with a calm intensity, and when he spoke, his voice carried an accent that no one could place, a mix of tones and rhythms unlike any language they had ever heard, yet somehow still understandable. Samuel claimed without hesitation or nervousness that he was not from this world. At first, people laughed, assuming he was just an eccentric traveler telling tall tales to amuse himself or attract attention. But Samuel didn't behave like a man seeking amusement. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone stating a fact. When pressed, he described his home as a place where the skies were a constant shade of violet, where rivers flowed with a silvery liquid that shimmered even under the faintest light, and where the air carried a faint hum that was both sound and sensation. He said there were no stars in his sky, only swirling currents of light like moving paintings above. His descriptions were so vivid that even the most skeptical listeners felt momentarily transported. What struck people most, however, was how he described our world. He spoke of Earth with the same curiosity and slight detachment a biologist might use when describing an unfamiliar species, fascinated but not personally connected. He claimed he had been sent here, though he refused to say by whom or for what purpose. His knowledge of the town's layout, its people, and even events that had not yet happened, began to unsettle those who interacted with him. For example, the day after he arrived, he told a local shopkeeper to avoid crossing the bridge that morning. The shopkeeper laughed off the warning, but an hour later, part of the bridge collapsed into the river after years of unnoticed decay. Another time he approached a farmer and suggested storing the harvest earlier than planned. Days later, an unseasonal frost struck the valley, ruining crops for everyone except that farmer. Word of these strange predictions spread quickly, and the town began to view Samuel with a mix of awe, suspicion, and fear. Some believed he was a prophet. Others whispered that he might be a demon or a trickster spirit. His calm demeanor never changed, no matter how people treated him, and his eyes always seemed to look just past whoever he was speaking to, as if watching something no one else could see. His presence began to stir tension in the community. People who once dismissed his otherworldly claims now avoided him in the streets, crossing to the other side or muttering prayers under their breath. Others, more curious than fearful, sought him out, hoping to learn secrets about the future or the world beyond our own. He answered questions and riddles, never directly, and his words often sounded poetic, but carried a weight that lingered in the minds of those who heard them. Children were both fascinated and terrified of him. Some would gather outside the small cabin he was given on the edge of town, daring each other to knock on his door, while others would run away screaming if they caught sight of him in the marketplace. There were also odd occurrences that began happening around him. Clocks would run backward in his presence, animals would grow restless when he passed by, and electrical devices, though rare in that rural area, would flicker or fail when he entered a room. He seemed unbothered by these anomalies, explaining them only as small adjustments or echoes from where I come from. The more he spoke, the more it seemed that his version of reality was fundamentally different from ours. He once told a group of curious townsfolk that time, as we understand it, was not linear where he came from. He said he could walk forward into an event and then return before it had even begun, and that memory and destiny were the same thing in his world. This unsettled many, especially when he mentioned seeing moments of their lives that had yet to occur. Despite his strange nature, there was something undeniably magnetic about Samuel. Even those who distrusted him found themselves drawn to hear him speak. It was as though he carried a fragment of another reality with him, a reality both beautiful and deeply alien. His stories of vast glass cities floating in the air, creatures with minds shared between thousands of bodies, and of oceans that sang in harmony under alien moons, left listeners haunted by a longing for something they couldn't name. And yet, when asked how he came to be here, he would only smile faintly and say, I followed the path that was written for me, and it led to you. This strange combination of charm, mystery, and the occasional unsettling demonstration of knowledge began to fracture the community. Arguments broke out between those who believed Samuel was a gift, perhaps even a messenger, and those convinced he was dangerous. Tensions reached a point where some demanded he be forced to leave, fearing that his presence would invite misfortune, or worse. But whenever such discussions took place, something uncanny would happen. Storms would roll in out of nowhere. Objects would fall from shelves without cause, or an overwhelming sense of dread would silence the room. Whether these were coincidences or something Samuel caused was never proven, but the timing was always precise. What no one could deny was that Samuel seemed to exist slightly apart from the rest of them, like a figure painted onto a different canvas and placed inside their own. People began keeping journals of their interactions with him, hoping to find patterns or clues in his words. Some claimed his eyes would briefly change color when he spoke about his home, flickering from pale gray to deep blue or even gold in the right light. Others swore that his shadow didn't always match his movements. By the time he had been in town for a few weeks, Samuel Hawthorne had become both the most talked about and the least understood person anyone had ever met. His arrival had been without warning, his claims too strange to dismiss entirely, and his knowledge too accurate to be pure guesswork. The idea that he truly might be from another world no longer seemed like the rambling of a madman, but an unsettling possibility that no one was prepared to confront. The town's quiet, predictable existence had been disrupted forever by the man who stepped out of the fog and declared that he had come from a place beyond anything they could imagine, a place where the rules of reality itself were not the same as here, and that he was here for a reason only he seemed to understand. As days turned into weeks, the unsettling nature of Samuel Hawthorne's presence became more pronounced, and it wasn't just because of the strange way he spoke or the cryptic stories he told. There were events, real, tangible occurrences that no one could explain, each one somehow tied to him. It began subtly. A group of townsfolk reported seeing Samuel standing at the edge of the forest long before dawn, staring into the dark as if watching something approach. When asked what he was doing, he simply said, waiting for the ripple.
Hours later,
A sudden violent gust of wind tore through the valley, uprooting trees and scattering debris as if a storm had passed through, yet the skies had remained clear and still. People began to recall similar moments when he seemed to know what was about to happen, his words vague yet undeniably accurate when the events unfolded. It wasn't just predictions, though. Samuel possessed knowledge that no one could explain. He knew the history of the town in startling detail, recounting events from over a century ago with the precision of someone who had been there to witness them firsthand. When a skeptical elder challenged him, Samuel described the exact location of a long-buried stone marker from the town's earliest settlement days, something no living person had ever mentioned. When they dug at the spot, the marker was there, just as he said it would be, engraved with names almost worn away by time. That discovery sent a shiver through the community, forcing them to question how he could possibly know such things. There were also the moments that seemed to defy the normal order of reality. A lantern, dropped in the street, should have shattered its glass, yet when Samuel bent to pick it up, it was perfectly intact, as though time had briefly reversed. A boy swore he had seen Samuel walking into town from the North Road at the same moment. Another
Eyewitness saw him leaving from the South Road.
When confronted about such things, Samuel would only smile faintly and say, "The world bends when it must." These small impossibilities became whispers that spread through every household. Whispered late at night in kitchens and bedrooms, always with the same uneasy conclusions. Something about him was beyond human. Animals reacted strangely in his presence. Dogs would whimper and hide, their bodies trembling, while cats would watch him intently, their tails twitching, as though recognizing something no one else could. Horses refused to move when he passed by, and birds would fall silent if he lingered too long near them. Farmers swore that when Samuel walked by their fields, the air felt thicker. The crops themselves seemed to lean subtly toward him. A few of the more superstitious townsfolk began marking their doorframes with symbols or sprinkling salt across their thresholds, believing it might protect them from whatever he carried with him. It wasn't only the animals and the land that seemed affected. People began having vivid dreams after encountering him. These dreams were unlike ordinary ones, full of landscapes that matched the strange descriptions Samuel gave of his home. violet skies. Cities of glass suspended in the air, oceans lit from within by pulsing lights. Some woke with tears on their cheeks, feeling an aching longing for something they had never known. Others awoke in cold sweats, haunted by visions of endless black corridors filled with whispers. Samuel never denied these dreams, but when asked about them, he would simply say, "Some doors open when you're not looking." The town's sense of safety began to erode. A carpenter, who had argued publicly with Samuel and accused him of being a fraud, was found days later wandering near the river. His eyes unfocused, unable to recall his name or how he had gotten there. He eventually recovered, but his memory of the encounter with Samuel remained blank, as if the moment had been erased. Another man claimed Samuel had told him to avoid a certain stretch of road for the next 3 days. He ignored the warning and was later found unconscious beside his overturned cart, insisting that something had stepped out of thin air and startled his horse. These incidents began to split the community into two groups: those who saw Samuel as a protector, someone who used his strange abilities to avert disasters, and those who believed he was the source of the disturbances, that his presence alone was drawing something dangerous into their lives. A few began pressing the local authorities to question him more seriously. But each time someone confronted him directly, the conversation seemed to twist and turn in circles. He would answer questions with statements that sounded profound but revealed nothing concrete, leaving people more unsettled than before. The church grew particularly concerned, and the local preacher began warning his congregation about false messengers who come disguised as men but carry the influence of other realms. Samuel attended one of these sermons without comment, sitting quietly in the back. When it ended, he approached the preacher, placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, and said something too softly for anyone else to hear. Witnesses claimed the preacher turned pale instantly and left without finishing his farewells to the congregation. After that day, he never spoke of Samuel again. There was also the matter of the strange symbols Samuel sometimes drew in the dirt or carved into pieces of wood. They didn't match any known alphabet, yet they carried an unsettling geometry shapes that seemed to shift when stared at too long. Lines that made the eyes ache, as though the brain was trying to interpret something beyond comprehension. One child found such a carving behind the cabin where Samuel lived, and when he brought it home, he began sleepwalking for the first time in his life. Murmuring in a language no one recognized, his parents burned the carving, and the sleepwalking stopped. The longer Samuel stayed, the more the townspeople realized that his presence was a constant disruption to the familiar rhythms of their lives. The air seemed to change around him, sometimes charged with static, other times heavy with a stillness that made even the bravest hesitate to breathe too loudly. He would disappear for hours or even days, only to return with dirt on his boots and a faint scent of something sharp and metallic clinging to him, like ozone after lightning. When asked where he had been, he would glance at the horizon and say, "I was where the lines cross," as though that explained anything at all. His knowledge extended far beyond the town, too. He could name distant cities and describe them in detail, even though he had never traveled there by any means known to the townsfolk. He knew when storms would arrive, when illness would spread, and even which houses would catch fire in the coming months, though he never explained how he knew, and his warnings were often ignored, until it was too late. The more people tried to dismiss his claims, the more impossible it became to deny that he was seeing something they could not. It reached a point where some began to feel that Samuel wasn't he simply predicting events, he might have been influencing them. Certain outcomes seemed to align too perfectly with his vague hints, as though the world itself adjusted to fit his words. The unease this caused was profound, making people question whether they were living their own lives or playing roles in a script he already knew by heart. His calm, watchful gaze never offered reassurance, only the sense that he was waiting for something, as if all of these strange moments were merely steps toward an inevitable conclusion. He alone could see. Then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, Samuel Hawthorne was gone. There was no farewell, no explanation, not even a hint that he intended to leave. One morning, the cabin at the edge of town stood empty, its door slightly ajar, the faint smell of damp earth lingering inside. The bed was neatly made, his few possessions gone except for a single scrap of paper left on the table. bearing one of those strange, twisting symbols that made the eyes ache to look at it. No one saw him walk away, and no tracks were found leading from the cabin, though the ground was soft from the rain the night before. His absence was noticed immediately. People who had grown used to his strange presence now found the air in town lighter, less charged, though a certain unease remained, as if he had left something behind that could not be swept away. At first, the townsfolk assumed he would return. Some believed he had gone into the forest on one of his unexplained journeys and would reappear as he always had, silent and composed. Days passed, then weeks, and no sign of him emerged. It was during this time that his name began to take on the weight of legend. People spoke of him in hushed tones, not wanting to draw too much attention to the memory. The stories grew, shaped by fear and fascination. Some claimed to have seen a figure matching his description standing in the mist at the far end of the valley, watching silently before vanishing. Others swore that on certain nights, if you stood near his empty cabin, you could hear a faint humming sound, like a low chord played on some distant, invisible instrument. The absence of Samuel did not erase the strangeness he had brought with him. In fact, it seemed to linger, as though whatever force had followed him or accompanied him had rooted itself in the town. A child wandering too close to the river reported seeing a shimmer in the air, like heat waves, and within it, the outline of Samuel's pale eyes staring back. Farmers continued to find their crops bending unnaturally toward certain points in the fields, even when no wind was present. Clocks in some homes began to skip forward or backward by a few minutes without reason. The preacher, who had once spoken against him, suffered recurring dreams of violet skies and a horizon that bent upward instead of down, dreams that left him waking with the taste of iron in his mouth. It was as if his departure had thinned the boundary between the ordinary world and wherever it was he claimed to be from. People started to find the strange symbols in places they had never been before, scratched into tree bark deep in the woods, etched into the stones along the riverbank, or faintly carved into the beams of barns that had stood untouched for decades. The symbols seemed to appear overnight, and those who stumbled upon them often reported odd sensations afterward: dizziness, a metallic ringing in their ears, or fleeting visions of places that did not exist in any known geography. The legacy Samuel left behind was not just physical, it was a change in the way people thought. Before him, the town had been a place of certainty, its rhythms predictable, its history well contained within the boundaries of human memory. After him, there was the persistent suspicion that the world was far larger, far stranger than anyone had imagined, and that the familiar rules of reality might not be as fixed as they had believed. People found themselves scanning the fog at dawn, listening for sounds just beyond the edge of hearing, watching shadows for movements that didn't match their sources. Children played games about the man from the other world, daring each other to walk to his cabin and look inside. Though none stayed long once they crossed the threshold, over time, Samuel's story began to take on the qualities of a cautionary tale, told by parents to warn their children about talking to strangers. Yet the tone was never entirely one of fear. There was an undercurrent of wonder in the retellings, as if some part of the community missed him despite the unease he had caused. His predictions, his strange knowledge, his quiet authority, these had unsettled many, but they had also protected some from disaster. Even those who had once called him a danger now admitted, in quieter moments, that they felt a kind of loss without his presence. The most chilling part of his legacy was the small number of people who claimed he had spoken to them privately in the days before his disappearance. These individuals, scattered across the town, each remembered him saying something cryptic, almost like a farewell, but couched in terms they could not fully understand at the time. One elderly woman recalled him telling her, "You will see me before the last ripple breaks." A young boy swore Samuel had told him to watch the places where the air bends. A shopkeeper said Samuel had looked directly into his eyes and said, "When the glass hums, follow it." At the time, these remarks seemed meaningless, but they became part of the whispers that kept his memory alive. As years passed, sightings continued to be reported, though none could be proven. A hunter claimed he saw Samuel standing on the surface of the frozen lake one winter morning, perfectly still, not disturbing the ice. By the time the hunter blinked, he was gone. A traveling merchant spoke of meeting a pale-eyed man on the road who gave him detailed directions through a dense fog, leading him to safety. When the merchant asked his name, the man only smiled and continued walking into the mist. These accounts were dismissed by some as tricks of memory or the mindless way of making sense of the strange. But others held them as proof that Samuel was still out there, slipping between worlds, watching. Even in the absence of concrete evidence, the belief in Samuel's otherworldly nature grew stronger with each passing year. His cabin eventually fell into ruin, its roof collapsing, its walls swallowed by vines, yet no one dared to tear it down. It remained a silent reminder of the time when the town had been touched by something or someone from beyond. Visitors who came upon it often remarked on the stillness of the place, a stillness that felt different from ordinary quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. What frightened some and fascinated others was the possibility that Samuel's disappearance was not an ending at all, but merely a transition. If his claims were true, he really had come from another world, then his vanishing might have been nothing more than a return to where he belonged. And if he could leave so easily, perhaps he could come back just as suddenly. The thought was both comforting and terrifying, because if Samuel Hawthorne could appear in the middle of a foggy road one evening, speaking of skies without stars and rivers of silver, then he could just as easily appear again, carrying with him whatever strange forces and unsettling truths had followed him the first time.